My name is Laia Greeno, and I'm heading the Initiative for Open Ag Funding, and welcome you to this webinar on supply and demand, improving the ag funding data landscape. Our goal with this webinar is to present some of the findings of the research we've been doing, both into the availability of agricultural investment data and into the demand for that data. So here is our agenda for the day. As we shared in the invitation, we're going to break this webinar into two sections. In part one, we are going to be presenting our research. So I'll begin with an overview of the project first for those who may not already have spoken to us as part of that research. We will try to unmute everyone for the second agenda item to have you all introduce yourselves, and just looking for your name and the organization that you're working with. Then we'll move on to our two presentations, one on the supply of agricultural investment data, and that will be with Open Data Services, who conducted that research. And then we'll move on to demand, where each of the partners of the Open Ag Funding Initiative will present on the research findings of their consultations on data. And we'll do about 10-15 minutes for each of these presentations and then break for questions after each of them. So that will be the first hour of the webinar, and then we'll take a quick break for those that need to step away or who need to get coffee before we move into part two of the webinar, which is a discussion on how we can move forward with the findings, based on the findings of the landscape analysis and consultations on data needs. So just to give you an idea of who's working with us on this Open Ag Funding Initiative, this is a project led by Interaction, but we are working with Development Gateway, Foundation Center, the CGIAR led by IFPRI, Open Data Services, and Publish What You Fund. So before we jump into the discussions, like I said, I wanted to give you a quick overview of the project. And overall, what the Open Ag Funding Initiative is trying to do is to big picture end hunger and reduce food insecurity. And the way that we want to go about this is to make sure that the investments we're making in this sector are more effective. So we believe that access to comprehensive, comparable, timely information is essential to improving decision-making around investments and to increasing accountability for resources spent in this sector. However, we know from our own experience and research through this project that there's a few issues. Either the data doesn't exist, or if the data does exist, people either don't have access to the available information or aren't aware that it exists, or the data that is available isn't good enough quality or isn't relevant to their needs. So what we hope to do with this project, which is the last piece there, is to ensure that the information is published and that whatever is published meets the needs of those funding or implementing food security and agriculture projects. I know there are a vast amount of needs related to data in this sector, so I wanted to take a moment to explain what kind of data we're focusing on as part of this project. So first, we're focusing on international assistance from bilateral and multilateral donors, foundations, NGOs, and research institutes that belong to the CGIAR. And the simplest way to put what type of data we're trying to make available is data related to who's doing what where, or to the investments that we're making in this sector. So things like which organizations are involved, how much funding was provided, where do activities take place, what are they meant to accomplish, etc. And I just included a snapshot of DFID's Dev Tracker so you can see the type of data we're trying to make available. This is just one example. I also wanted to tell you about the ways that you can participate in this project. To help us meet our goal of making data available and relevant, we've established two groups. One, a community of practice, and the second, an agriculture working group under the International Aid Transparency Initiative's Technical Advisory Group. So I just wanted to take a moment to explain what the purpose and the difference between each of them is, and then a bit about membership. So the purpose of the community of practice, as you see on your screen, is to promote improvements in the availability, quality, and use of ag investment data. So that includes doing things like helping us increase awareness of demand for this type of data, to inform the development of the standards and tools we'll be developing as part of this project from a user perspective, and to advocate for the publication of better data by all actors, and also promoting use of the data in decision making either within your own organization or in other organizations. The Ag Working Group, on the other hand, the purpose is to ensure that IATI data meets the needs of agricultural development and food security practitioners. So this group will play a more technical role in developing our proposals for making the International Transparency Initiative standard more relevant to agriculture and food security practitioners, and then also will be helping us develop tools to improve either the quality or the use of IATI data. And as you'll be hearing when Tim and Stephen present on the supply of data, we've come to the conclusion that the International Aid Transparency Initiative provides the best way to meet the needs of practitioners in the sector. So in terms of membership, membership is open to anyone, to either individuals or organizations. You can participate in both groups or just one, it depends on your interest. I'd say that the community of practice is probably better for agriculture and food security practitioners who really are looking to use this data as part of their work, while the IATI Ag Working Group might be more suitable for those responsible for publishing IATI data at their organizations or for sector data specialists. So we are going to go ahead and see if we can unmute folks to do the introductions, and I think I'm just going to unmute people from the top of the list. So let's see how this goes. Like I said, we're just looking for your name and organization.
Hi, I'm Frans van den Nij. I'm a data scientist at Expantia in Costa Rica.
Great. Welcome.
This is Catherine Vaughn with MCC, and I'm looking to learn for gender data also.
My name is Marco Vandenberg. I'm with the International Rice Research Institute in the Philippines.
I'm Rolf Cliff. I'm working with Dutch NGOs on IATI implementations.
Welcome.
Hello, I'm Marc Paquin with Unisfera in Montreal, Canada.
Others on the line?
Hi, Laia. I'm Wendy Rogers, and I'm the Senior Business Analyst on the IATI Technical Support Team, so obviously very joined up with this piece of work.
Great. Great to have you, Wendy. Thank you. Any others?
It's muted.
No, we
Hello?
can hear you.
Hi,
Yeah.
I'm Adafi Onaheim. I'm with Open Data Services.
Wonderful.
Hi, this is Chelsea Miller. I'm with Lutheran World Relief.
Hello, this is Martien Koopman from Smart Resultancy. I think I'm muted. I don't know.
No, we can hear you. Thank you.
Oh, okay. Yeah, okay.
Duncan Dewhurst, also with Open Data Services.
anyone else on the line? Okay, then I will mute everyone again. If you didn't get a chance to introduce yourself, feel free to use the chat function to do that. But for now, I am going to turn it over to Tim and Stephen with Open Data Services to present on the supply of agricultural investment data. So Tim, I am turning over the presenter function to you now.
Great. I will start sharing my screen in just a moment. And thanks all for joining us for this session. It's really good to have you all with us.
Muted.
So let's take you through. And sorry for the difficulty getting this on screen. So essentially, we set out with a brief to look at who's collecting data on ag investments, how it's being shared, what's the nature of that data, how it's being structured, and where the gaps or areas of duplication are in that. And in that we found there's three broad kinds of data we're talking about in ag investments. Firstly, we're looking at the aggregate level. What's the country or region level data on investments? And we're finding that that's coming from national statistics, from national budgets, or from regular or even ad hoc surveys. So something like the Agricultural Science and Technology Indicators give a view drawing on survey methods and other methods of aggregate level investments going into a country or a sector. Across those sources, many different classifications and data structures being used, but giving that high level picture. Then we get down to the project level, looking at projects that are being funded or implemented. And again, those might be drawn from donor systems, from country aid management platforms, and also from crowdsourcing or from the portfolios of projects that companies are engaged in. And key here was looking not only at projects from traditional donors, but also trying to get a view of what data is out there on private sector investments in the agriculture world also. And lastly, we can get down to the output level. What's the results data? What's the research outputs or the indicators on what a project has achieved? And there we're finding that's held in all sorts of different platforms, very patchy coverage of data available, often not being shared, often only in internal systems or in research repositories which don't necessarily link between a particular funding investment and a particular output in any tremendously clear way. Obviously, that data on investments, funding, resources is part of a wider landscape of data that we need to be conscious of, and many people on this call will work on this wider landscape as well. Things like geodata for agriculture, data on infrastructure, taxonomies, or data from agricultural extension surveys. So when we've been looking at the ag investment data landscape, we've been particularly focusing on these aggregate projects and output data, and particularly on projects and outputs, but cognizant that it needs to connect up with this wider landscape. So in our research, we try to dig into the different data sources, and in the report you'll find a link to the database of databases that we essentially built, trying to understand, is the data public? Is it restricted access? What's it covering? What's the temporal coverage? What's the sectoral coverage? And we find a real breadth of different sources there. Very positively, we find a lot that is public, a lot that is being shared, and lots of people very willing to share. But we find great variation in the quality, the breadth, and the depth of that data. So we identified 10 broad categories of source that can be found. Things like the OECD DAC reporting backwards looking but very comprehensive data on traditional donors' aid projects. We looked at data available through the International Aid Transparency Initiative, through aid management platforms and other data sets, right through to some of the really granular data that exists in platforms like ACVO's platform for water projects, aid projects, where the platform is transactional. It's a reporting platform as well as a project information platform. Very low coverage of the number of projects, but very in-depth data. So that analysis led us to this graph you should see, where we've tried to plot these types of data sources on a rough spectrum between whether they give us forward-looking data or historic data. and whether they can give us comprehensive information or only very basic and headline information. And the size of the bubble roughly equates to the kind of coverage that source has of the kinds of information we think people are looking for. And that led us to understanding that the source with the best prospect of improving the ag data landscape is there in the International Aid Transparency Initiative. And so that led us to doing a deeper dive into understanding what the data in IATI is currently like. What's the IATI data landscape here? And for that, I'll hand over to Stephen.
Thank you, Tim. So we as Tim says, we took a look into the existing data shared with the International Aid Transparency, and we found across the board there's something around about 550,000, 500,000 IATI activities published by over 450 different organisations. When we actually undertook this analysis, there were just about 400 organisations that were publishing data in the IATI format, and in the past couple of months that's increased by 50 or so, mainly Dutch NGOs. So IATI really is a dynamic and growing set of organisations openly sharing data in a standardised way. And from that we could really see that the agricultural investment data is readily open and available, particularly through the different data sets and the interfaces that are available around IATI, and I'll talk a bit more about those in a moment. And we also could summarise that nearly all the major bilateral and multilateral donors active in agricultural investments share data in the IATI format. So that was very encouraging to see that there was a real match between the larger and active organisations and those that are already opening data using IATI standard, the IATI standard. And the last point really is that we also found it very encouraging to talk directly during the landscape analysis, talk directly with some of those publishers, and in other cases get data changed and updated along the way. The next slide, please, Tim. Okay, and our methodology to look at the IATI corpus, the set of data that's really quite large, was to focus in on in this piece of work the sector code list that organisations use within their IATI activities, and we took the view that there are around about 40 of these codes that organisations could use to describe their activities. And for example, 31191 describes agricultural services, and in the report there's the list of all those codes. So we looked across the 500,000 activities to find those that share and describe their work using these codes relevant to agricultural investments. And we noticed that there was a greater take-up of the more in-depth codes rather than the generic codes that might be very broad. So that was quite encouraging to see that organisations publishing data using the IATI standard are already starting to get to some detail using those sector codes. And we also observed that there's a small set of those codes that have the most traction just at the moment, but that's probably indicative of the nature of funding and the nature of activities taking place. And we could also find that amongst this, there's a small number of publishers accounting for most of the IATI data that we could see. In other words, the larger organisations were publishing lots of data and continue to do so. On the other hand, there's a very interesting, what we might call a long tail of organisations publishing a small amount of data, but equally quite detailed in its nature. But at the volume level, it's a small number of IATI publishers right now, and these publishers tend to be the larger institutions, the existing publishers of OECD DAC reports, for example. Okay, on to the next slide, please, Tim. One thing we think, and I think it's important to highlight, just in this journey, is that it's probably not helpful to think of IATI as a single database. It's certainly a whole corpus of data through which we can analyse and query, but it was really interesting to look at IATI in the different interfaces that publishers and organisations make available. So there's a screenshot here of the Swedish interface to their IATI data, and on the right-hand side, the Dutch ministry, again, around their own data. So that's just an interesting context we think about when you're using IATI data to consider it as, at the moment, 450 different data sets that share this common standard platform, common standard way of describing their work. And it's just the caution against thinking about that as a single unitary database. And last slide from me, Tim. Yep, thank you. So if we understand that there's a wide number of organisations talking about agricultural investments, and a lot of those are using the sector codes to do so. The other thing that we looked at, that I just wanted to draw out from the report, is that broadly speaking, the activities that we can find are of general quality. So they talk about the who, where, when, and what, particularly in terms of those sector codes I mentioned. A much smaller subset of those activities that we looked at detail things such as subnational geography and results data, and I think that's probably reflective of the wider pattern amongst the whole of the IATI publishers themselves. So just to highlight really that the activities we found could begin to take us on this journey of who's working with whom, where, and on what. Back over to you, I think, Tim.
Yeah, so what you really see there is we've got a framework that has the potential to give us quite rich data, but the reality of what we're seeing right now is we get that high level, what's provided, what are the projects, and so on, but getting down to the detailed information is a gap right now, and it'll be useful when we hear about some of the user needs to see how far the data that's currently available meets those needs. As Stephen says, this is often though made available to people not as data, but through tooling and another Stephen mentioned, those detailed categorizations that we see in some files rely on a tool being able to produce detailed classified data. So we've got creation tools out there, but we need some modification to improve the landscape. We've got mapping tools out there. There's quite a mature set of mapping tools in terms of the platforms running OpenAidMap and other tools that are aware of different levels of geography, perhaps not yet connecting up to all of the geoinformation systems there are for agriculture, that wider geodata part of the landscape, but we've got tooling emerging and lots of learning about that tooling. We see a range of visualization tools available and query platforms, but where we see there's perhaps some gaps or tools that are not being used heavily right now are tools for enriching the data that's already published. So there have been some experiments with auto-tagging research outputs against vocabularies such as AgriVoc, quite widely used in that context. Some work on geocoding projects from the project documents, but very little data is being enriched after it's published right now. And tools for helping do that quality assurance to make sure the data that's published is up to scratch are also an area with some gaps. So looking across that whole landscape and looking at the supply side only, we looked at 7 recommendations, and these are things we really want to test in the conversation. And that framework needs to be accompanied by quality assurance tools, tools that can validate data and help publishers know that they're producing data that's up to scratch. And we know tools on their own are not enough. There needs to be support for those publishers to do that and to do that well. And as Stephen mentioned, during this research process, there were a couple of times where we contacted publishers of data to say, we can't quite understand this, there's areas where you could tweak that and improve that, and people were very quick to update and improve data sets, but it needs that active conversation and to recognize that this isn't a process of building one big database, it's a process of working with a distributed community of data providers. Secondly, we need to look at how that data is going to be collected and brought together, and to recognise, whilst we're talking a lot about IATI here, that's not the only source of data out there. There are surveys that go on at a national level, there are aid management platforms, there's private sector actors who manage their own systems who won't necessarily produce that as IATI data. So any process will need to be cognizant of different entry points to providing data and to have some simplified standards and processes for that. And lastly, we can't forget the need for curation, the need to assemble and quality assure a corpus of agricultural investment data that's ready for use. If we rely on users just going to that distributed set of data sets and finding their own way through it, it's going to remain very challenging to pick a way through this landscape and answer key questions. So we need better tools to enrich the data and to bring it together in a corpus. Really the sense is, if we'd been doing this a couple of years ago, we'd have been saying it's almost impossible to find out anything at all. Now we're able to say there are sources of data out there, there's people publishing, there's flows of data being updated regularly, but we need to really focus very heavily on getting that up to the quality that can answer the kinds of questions and user needs that our next set of presentations will touch on. So I'll pause there. As Leah said, in got time, a few questions, which can either happen through people raising their hand in the attendee list or typing their questions in the chat, and Stephen and I will try and respond to any questions there are.
Great. Thanks, Tim. Thanks, Stephen, for that presentation. And also, you got in your chat box the link to the full report, including a link where, if you'd like, you can provide comments on the report, which we will be looking at as we take this project forward to the next stage. Oh, I see a question from Matthew. Matthew, I'm going to unmute you.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, that's fantastic. So, well, I'm intrigued by the very last thing that you said, which is taking this project to the next phase. Which phase is that, and what are the plans?
That's an excellent question, and that's actually what we're hoping to discuss with all of you in the second part of this webinar. So basically, you know, we've addressed both the supply and demand side, and so based on the findings of that, of what's available and what's actually needed, we're trying to bring those two into closer alignment. And so we're going to be taking a close look at the IATI standard, which covers the type of information we've talked about this morning, and then seeing whether it meets the needs and it's just an issue of needing to improve the quality of the data that's being made available, or if there are certain things that need to be added or modified according to that standard in order to make it more suitable for practitioners in this sector in particular, for the agriculture and food security sector. So that is our next major piece of work, and obviously we don't want to just throw out random ideas. We really want to test this with the people who would be using that information to make decisions or hold organizations accountable for the funding they're providing in the sector.
Right.
Any other questions?
Can I ask a follow-on question?
Yes, go ahead, and then we'll go to Rolf. I see your hand up. Go ahead, Matthew.
So you have a data standard. Do you also have an ontology standard or a taxonomy of vocabularies that you're using for those specific data standards? to ease the curation problem.
So maybe I can come in a bit there. So the one section of the report that I didn't include in the slides, there is a section on taxonomies and classification. As Stephen mentioned, the existing data published through the International Aid Transparency Initiative tends to use mostly the OECD Development Assistance Committee's classification of sectors, which goes not terribly deep in the kinds of categories that maybe ag specialists would be interested in. So we have been doing some work thinking about how taxonomies like AgriVoc and so on might be used within the context of ag investment projects. I think that's very much an open question for the next phase of this work, is to understand the balance of effort of getting publishers of data to tag against those taxonomies versus getting tools downstream to enrich data, auto-tag, or classify data against some of those taxonomies, and to really understand the right taxonomies to use. There's been some interesting work as well recently looking at OECD DAC sector codes and sustainable development goals, and kind of what classification makes most sense for decision makers. A lot of that's going to need to come out of the user research to understand what users need to work out what push we put. But if you've got experience of kind of working with particular taxonomies, we'd be really keen to hear about that.
Oh, terrific. Great. Well, I'm not sure if it's appropriate to say it, but right now, but we're actually putting on a conference about the ontologies of food and ag in November here at UC Davis, and of course we would love to have you guys come and participate, because I wasn't aware of this particular effort. I didn't hear you mention GoDan or a couple of other efforts that are out there. Is that it going to be in the report? I haven't seen the report yet.
We've joined GoDan and consider our work to contribute to their goal of making data in this sector more open. So fall under that umbrella, but taking forward a very specific piece of the open data they're seeking to make available.
Right. This is great. It's very exciting.
Well, thank you. I think we have a couple more questions, so I'm going to turn it over to Rolf. Rolf, I'm going to unmute you so you can pose your question, and I think you probably have to unmute yourself.
Can I jump in just very quickly on this on these questions on the ontologies?
Oh, sure. Go ahead, Mel.
Yeah.
And if you could introduce yourself so people know who you are.
Oh, yeah, sorry. So Melanie Baku, I'm Senior Program Manager at IFPRI, and I've been working the past 2 years on mapping some of the CGIAR investment portfolios. So I'm here. I'm wearing that hat today. I just wanted to say, yeah, there's a parallel initiative called the GACS. I think it's the Global Agricultural Concept Scheme, which I think is also receiving some funding foundation, and that's a big effort to try to reconcile a number of the ag and nutrition ontologies. So starting with AgriVoc and AIMS and some other libraries, and I think it's currently led by FAO. So I just posted a link, and I think if you Google GACS, you can find more on the web as well.
Thanks, Mel.
I think they have a working group, etc., but I'm not completely up to date on what's the status of the effort. I mean, last I saw there was they've kind of managed to, link like half of the main vocabularies in ag. So I don't know if that's something you'll be discussing at that event. Just FYI.
Thanks, Mel. And Mel dropped a link to information about that effort in the chat box, which I'll share with everyone shortly. But Rolf, go ahead and ask your question.
Okay, thanks, Laia. Thanks, Tim and Stephen, for the presentation. Yeah, I don't see a chat box, so I'm missing probably on some of the links. I have a question about the coverage of the data. You mentioned that it's a lot of the bigger institutions that seem to be well represented. And as we know in the IATI community, there's a bit of an issue trying to get basically the next step in the chain covered as well. And I would be really interested to know if you found out what coverage there is in that sense in CSOs and research institutions, and maybe also where would be the biggest win in getting more organizations on board with this.
Rolf, and you're talking about IATI data, I think, specifically.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah. In the report, I put a link into section 5 of the IATI, so we'll follow that up with the direct link just in case you can't find it right now. I think what I was trying to reflect on there really was that the volume of data. When you look at the whole, when we take this approach, first of all, we look at IATI data. We filter that by the sector codes to give us some analysis, and then when we look at that, you can clearly see that the United States, the EU, Japan, Sweden, Spain, UK, for example, are in volume the biggest publishers of data using those sector codes. That's not reflective, perhaps, of the quality of that data. I was just trying to highlight that the publishers, the trend seems to be the publishers with the most data are also in line with those sharing most around agricultural investments. Down at there's a real long tail of publishers. I think we found about 120 publishers, and there are 83 that have less than 500 counts of ag sectors, and that table's in the report as well. So I think it's more of a broad sweep of the data at the moment, just to understand who, where, and what. But as you know from your work in IATI, the real interesting parts could be in the long tail, or those organisations that are publishing very in-depth data. So I think that the next point I'd make is that when I began to look at the activities in detail, I couldn't look at every single activity, but some of the smaller publishers in volume were also publishing quite interesting data with results and geolocation as well. So quantity doesn't always equal quality is the message.
And I guess maybe just to pick up on, I think one of the other issues you're alluding to there around following the chain down. So certainly to preempt some of the kind of user need presentations that will come up, I think a big gap still is going to be around getting to the implementing partners on the ground, getting beyond the kind of $1 million project to the delivery partners. One of the things we do touch on in the report is the emergence of open contracting data as another potential data source that helps get there, because whilst project level often is kind of a first tier implementing partner, getting down to the who are the organizations at that very, very local level working on things, maybe contracts and spend data can get us there further. Those are at a much earlier stage of kind of rolling out in standardized forms than the IATI's been, but certainly areas we should keep an eye on to have these multiple entry points of kind of bringing data together.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks, Rolf, for the questions. And this is a perfect transition to the next part of our presentation, which is looking at the demand. So just one moment while I switch back to my screen. Okay, so we've looked at the supply. Now we're going to look at the demand. Sorry, I'm hearing some typing, so if you can mute yourself if you're not speaking, that would be great. So we are just going to, like I said at the beginning, we're going to have each partner present on the findings of the consultations they've done into the data demand or the data needs of different groups. And just an advance warning that we only have 2 minutes for each person to present, so this is going to be very high level, but just wanted to give you a sense of what we're finding. So first up is Taryn Davis with Development Gateway. Taryn, go ahead.
Thanks. Hi, this is Taryn Davis, and I'm here with Danny Walker, my colleague at Development Gateway. So quickly, we just wanted to talk about what we did. So we went with so far 5 different donors who work in agriculture to really understand what data they need about projects that others are doing in country when they are implementing their projects. So on the left column of the slide, you'll see these are some of the things that came up most often, and a lot of them are ones that can already be found in different sources, but maybe people aren't as familiar with them. So we talked about IATI and some of that information like locations, budget data, and expenditure data, project dates, results information, and this was really important for them to know, what type of projects have been successful so far in agriculture and learning from those and knowing also what hasn't been successful so far and to make sure that they don't fall into that same pitfall. One of the things, though, that you won't find so easily is the specific value change that we found everyone was saying would be really important. And this would be knowing specifically what type of crops people are working on. And we had people give examples of if everyone else is working in maize, we'll want to focus on another crop such as soy to make sure that the nutrition is balanced out, or make sure that we aren't too heavily focused on one crop. Another big example we saw was wanting to know who the local implementers, other organizations, are working with, and this was listed as important because it would help them know what organizations they could and maybe should work with as well, and also just during the initial project planning to know who they should talk to during their consultations to get a good idea of the lay of the land on the ground. And so knowing this information up hand is really important for them in knowing that well. And then there's also a lot of talk about knowing demographics, socioeconomic data, and even some baselining data. So this is going down specifically to soil data was brought up a lot, of knowing specifics, information like that. So this is kind of the things that we saw came up a lot in their data needs, and a lot of this information, some of this information, especially this value chains, is something that can be a little bit harder to find. So again, don't have too much time to go into depths, but these are some of the biggest things that have come up during our conversations.
Thanks, Taryn. So next up is Gabi Fitz from the Foundation Center.
Hi, everybody. Can you hear me? Hopefully. Okay.
Yeah, if you could just talk a little louder than usual, that would be great.
Okay, great. We actually spoke or have spoken with a number of private foundations on the donor side and talked to them about what their data needs are and what their process really is for when and how they use data and external knowledge sources in their investment decisions. And so a lot of this resonates with what Tim and Stephen and Development Gateway found as well. Donors are really at the program level trying to understand what others are doing and funding, where the gaps are in current funding, whether that's at a specific crop level or at a regional level, and really where they could make the greatest difference. So all kinds of different data types and data sources go into helping to answer those questions. An interesting thing that we did talk with a number of foundations about was sort of when they were looking for data, and I think it's something to keep in mind as we build this project moving forward, that there was really the need for data and external knowledge sources at the strategy setting moment, and then data for monitoring and impact measurement. And then the 360 degrees really came when they tried to translate that, the results data or outcome data back into informing the strategy and setting strategy. So I think they have different kinds of data needs at different kinds of moments. Largely, the foundations we were speaking with were not actually aware of IATI and were relying almost exclusively on relationships with other funders and affinity groups, on their own in-country staff. And then because they had the resources, they were really commissioning research, their own research, in order to get at some of the aggregate level data that they were struggling to find. So they are looking at landscape analyses, market analyses, demographic analyses, a lot of what we just heard from the last presenter. But we're going out and commissioning that research, feeling like their questions were quite unique, and then getting researchers to answer them directly. Some of the challenges are ones that are going to be familiar to a lot of people on this call, that there were differing definitions of what they even meant by agriculture and the agricultural field. And that some of the difficulties, but also the richness in this work really comes from the fact that they're working at the intersections of different issues and fields. So many of them, yes, they're working on agriculture, but they're working on agriculture as it relates to land rights or land sovereignty, or as it relates to food and nutrition. And so really trying to find data that also answers questions at those intersections continues to be a challenge. And then lastly, and this kind of gets to some of the needs a lot of them spoke to around the granularity of the data, which is really the data needs that are associated with movement building initiatives or partnership driven initiatives, where they really were looking for data at the very local level about who's working on projects, what are they finding, what are they learning, what are their needs on the ground, in a way that they're really relying heavily on in-country staff to answer those questions. So that's a very quick summary of some of what we've been hearing from that group of stakeholders.
Thanks very much, Gabi. And next I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Mike Castro at Interaction.
Thanks, Laya. Well, we've gone ahead and had consultations with over 10 organizations or 10 INGOs, and within those INGOs we've spoken to multiple individuals ranging from senior leadership within the organization to resource development officers to policy staff and those who are most in charge in implementing these agricultural and food security related programs to get a wide variety of perspectives and data needs. And so the main two points that we want to highlight is that at the broader level, NGOs, particularly INGOs, want to avoid duplication and to leverage the expertise of other organizations that are implementing agriculture and food security programs. So the type of data that they need to avoid those pitfalls is information on what's been mentioned before on implementers, on who is implementing the program, particularly those in countries that are implementing the program, to identify potential partners as well as to leverage what others have done and avoid duplication. So they also need information on subnational location as to where in country these interventions are being implemented, the sort of investments amounts to just have a general sense of the scope of the programs and who are the intended beneficiaries in these programs. Now, if we go into the sort of the last parts of why NGOs need this data of determining what works and frankly what doesn't work, and to actually assess the performance of these interventions, they really need information on results, on goals and objectives, and sectors and the specific value chains to really learn from what other organizations have been doing. And that's something that was a key takeaway in these consultations. That's something that essentially everyone who we've consulted with have mentioned, that this is imperative, that they need to make smarter investments in the agriculture and food security sector.
Great, thanks, Mike. And if I can change the slide, I will turn it over to Mel. Mel, go ahead. Mel, we can't hear you.
I'm sorry.
Oh, there you go. Yeah, just speak loudly.
Okay. So on the CGIAR, so the CGIAR is not a member of IATI right now, but there's been some push.
Louder?
Yeah, can you hear me?
If you can try to speak even louder, we're getting a request for that.
Okay. Okay, let me see if I can change something. Okay, that's good. Yeah, I was saying, so we're not a member of IATI, but there's been some activities, especially over the past 2 years, in trying to collect information from the from the different entities. Can you hear?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay, so the CG, since the reform, is organized into 15 large research programs and also 15 research centers. So those are the sort of funding mechanisms for the CGIAR. And you know, we are present in over more than 70 countries, and there's over 4,000 to 5,000, you know, permanent or semi-permanent locations. So in the early consultations and stakeholders meeting and interviews we had, the key requests were for the number of locations and activities, but a lot of the CRP program directors or people making decisions on strategies really want this information overlaid with the key geographies of interests. So depending on the research programs, it could be different types of dryland areas or different focus areas for wheat and maize, or the wheat and maize mega environments. So there's a lot of very ag-specific definitions, and when strategy makers look at, you know, number of activities, a number of partners, number of locations, they also they want this information usually cross-reference across geographies. So that's maybe something that didn't quite come up from the previous slides. So that was a big ask. The other one was to come up with very simple indicators on the numbers of, so potentially the number of farmers reached, the number of farmers trained across activities, also the socioeconomic characteristics of those farmers, and the number of poor and non-poor beneficiaries. And yeah, and then some other indicators have to do with reach, and then some about impact. So reach was the number of partners and institutions that we're working with, or that receive training or receive institutional support. And then measure of impact, and that's an axe that's coming quite strong now in the next round of research program proposals, is about diffusion, trying to track the diffusion of agricultural technologies. So when we mean technologies, usually we mean improved technologies, improved seeds, improved management practices on the farm. And then what's also the adoption of those technologies. So we want to be able to track activities, and then on the impact side, what's the diffusion and adoption of different technologies. And another kind of data needs, so in addition to what the other speakers have mentioned, is well, because we are research institutions, we usually want a pretty high level of detail of what the activity is about. So not only the value chain and the commodity, but also the type of research and improved technologies. And so one of the activities we engage now is building this ontology of ag and nutrition technologies, and they are divided up into different branches, from germplasm to irrigation and other management practices. So that's something we're looking at, maybe potentially integrating into an ag IATI standard as well.
Great. Thanks very much, Mel, and our other presenters. So we're a little bit over time, but want to make sure that you all have a chance to ask questions about the demand side as well. So if you have any questions, as you did before, feel free to type it into the question box or raise your hand, and we'll unmute you so you can pose your question. In the meantime, as you think of those, I just want to mention that we're currently working on writing up the findings of these consultations on the different groups, and we'll be making those available in June, so next month. And so if you've signed up for our project newsletter, or which we'll drop the link to, so you have access to that, and we'll also send around an email afterwards with the presentation and information on how to get involved in the project if you aren't part of our list already. But we'll announce the reports there as well. So, any questions on user data needs? Matthew, go ahead.
Oh, I have a question for anybody in the audience in general. I heard our last speaker, and I guess I'm not seeing a chat window or a report somewhere. I was hoping to get. I didn't get every speaker's name, so I can't really address anybody by name. But our last speaker just mentioned that they were looking at developing ontologies for nutrition and food technologies, which is really interesting to me. And I've heard some other things about vocabularies in there. I'm wondering to what extent the speakers in general who are interested in this are coordinating the international community for biological ontologies. If anybody has anything to speak about that, and the conference coming up in August for the ICBO. Is there any relationships developing there?
Okay.
Mel, I might let you. Yes, go ahead.
So there is some coordination. So inside the CGIAR, we were coordinating this work on ontologies with Biodiversity mostly, and also the consortium office in Montpellier. So at Biodiversity, we're working with the crop ontology team, and we'd assume that that's probably the main link for you to the bio ontology work. So we had yeah, we were trying to fill in one specific gap. So we're not going into some of the existing kind of biotechnology and other like germplasm related ontologies. Like the ontology we're developing was really for decision making on investment. So it's a bit more higher level, and it's being reviewed now. So we have we have a small working group, and it's being kind of circulated and reviewed, but with a big input from Biodiversity ontology team. It's called ANT, like Agricultural and Nutrition Technology Ontology. Yeah, but it's not. I mean, we're planning maybe a publication or something around it, but it's not happened yet.
Thanks, Mel. We do have another question from Catherine Vaughn at MCC, who's asking whether we've seen demand for gender disaggregated data. And I can comment on that, but if some of I'll turn to my colleagues first.
This is Taryn at Development Gateway, and yes, that's definitely come up, especially for a lot of those data sets. They listed as expecting them to be disaggregated by gender. It's something that's really important for them, especially knowing the beneficiaries of the project. If that's like mothers or children, it definitely should be gender disaggregated.
Yeah, for some of the INGOs working in this sector, their sort of specific interventions that they implement are sort of gender specific, so that type of information is very keen to what they're planning to do and what they're currently doing. So yes, that sort of the gender lens is very much needed from the NGO perspective.
Yeah, and just to add to what Mike said, it's both on the implementing side. So organizations are focused on targeting women, and so they're interested in the efforts of other organizations and knowing who's targeting women as well. But also from an advocacy perspective, there's groups that are, who are focused on making sure that women also see benefits from international assistance and in this sector in particular. And so they also need gender disaggregated data to assess the extent to which that's happening. Any other questions?
Sorry, this is Matthew again. I have one more question.
Go ahead.
You mentioned the report in the chat window. I'm still not seeing it. Are you making that available?
The report on this, on the data needs, aren't public yet or aren't ready yet. We're in the process of writing those, and they'll be available next month. And sorry, it says that what we're typing in the chat box is going to the entire audience, but clearly that is not the case. So we'll make sure to send anything that's been sent in the chat in a follow-up email to everyone.
And is the session itself being recorded?
It is. And so we'll make that available as well, yes.
Oh, great, great.
Great. So we are going to take a break now for 2 minutes. So if you need to grab coffee, go ahead, or bathroom break, and we'll be back at, let's say, 9:08 to start our next part of the webinar, the discussion on how to take this work forward.
Wonderfully precise. And just to give a quick sense of what we'll do in that for those of you who want to stay with us is out of the conversation we've been trying to draw some themes that are coming up that we're going to have to address in taking this project forward, and we just want to get your thoughts and reflections on those. So things around taxonomies, results data, organization data, location data. So we'll just take each of those, give each 5 minutes or so to draw on your insights and wisdom just as we start into the next phase of kind of responding to the supply and demand challenges that have been highlighted. So talk to you all in a few moments.
Great, thanks, Tim. Okay, I think we're ready to get started. Hopefully we will have a good discussion, and I think what I'm going to do for this part is just unmute everyone. You have the option of muting yourself, but obviously since this is a discussion, we want you to be able to speak. So I will turn it over to Tim now to get us started on this discussion.
Fantastic, thanks, Leah. So yeah, this is very much a chance to get people's more general thoughts and feedback. I've identified a couple of different themes I think came out of our discussion so far, and maybe we'll jump into each of those for a few minutes each. And the first of the questions I want to pose, which I think is a tension that's coming up, is between whether we want complete information, so we want complete coverage. Do we want to know in any given country or sector every single activity that is taking place? Is that the most important thing? Or setting up a bit of a false dichotomy, but you can't always have everything, is comprehensive information on a smaller number of projects more important? So obviously we'd like both. We'd like complete coverage and really comprehensive information, but is people's sense that one is more important than the other, and also that one is more challenging to achieve than the other? So maybe I can pose that as the first question for discussion.
Can I pitch into this discussion here?
Absolutely, please do.
This is Danny Walker from Development Gateway, and based on our discussions, I think that's a really good distinction between comprehensive and kind of cross-cutting data. And I think in terms of the discussions we've had, it would probably be more helpful to have more data for every project. I think it does depend on the goal, whether it's coordination between donors or the quality and comprehensiveness of individual projects. And I think in our discussions, donors and partners really prioritized knowing each other's initiatives and especially the locations of different initiatives. And so I think a more broad, cross-cutting data set would be helpful for the coordination of donor activities. And even though a comprehensive, more detailed data on a few projects would perhaps be helpful in terms of individual project quality, if that makes sense.
that makes a lot of sense. Does that fit with other people's experience and kind of reflections, or are there other thoughts on that particular question?
Some of the discussions that we've had is that finding this data is really resource intensive, both financially and staff's time. So essentially, if you were able to have a sort of a broad data set of what everyone is doing, by default you're reducing the cost of operations for a lot of these, particularly INGOs, and one would think that they could use those resources more usefully. Areas total amount of funding that they have for specific agriculture and food security programs. So in that case, I think getting the complete information and then going on and having sort of different steps on how do you improve the comprehensiveness of information would be a sort of a wiser strategy.
Thanks, Michael. I wonder if any of our attendees on the call have particular experience of sectors that have managed to get things comprehensive, because I think, yes, getting broad coverage and comprehensive for everything is tricky, but there's particular communities of practice, I'm sure, out there who've done a good job of being more comprehensive, either in people's kind of engagement research. Did that come up, or attendees on the call? Are they good examples we should be looking out for for learning from?
I point to the recent the work the IATI community have been doing around comprehensiveness and coverage of data sets, which is available by the IATI dashboard. So I don't know if Wendy's with us still, but that's an interesting part to look at IATI from those two perspectives of broad and depth of the data sets around. I'm not sure if Wendy's with us. No.
Wendy, if you are trying to say something, I think you're on mute yourself. So if you unmute yourself, you should be able to comment. There you go.
I'm here now. I'll just get a cup of tea. So thanks for that. Yes, just to add to what Steve was saying, from an IATI perspective, we look at essentially 4 aspects of data quality in terms of IATI data, of which coverage is the most recent one that we started looking at in terms of seeing how much information an organisation that's publishing to IATI is actually providing to us. So of the amount that effectively that they have to spend on their operations and their projects and programs, we're actually looking to see how much of that is also being reported to IATI as well, to start getting some idea of the real width of information that we're carrying within the IATI data sets. But as Stephen says, we also look at comprehensiveness, so looking at the various different fields that are available in the IATI standard and which publishers are providing information in which fields. So again, we have a good sort of appreciation for, again, sort of adding to a slightly separate dimension of width in terms of the data that we have. And we also, because IATI was originally conceived primarily to provide forward-looking data, we look at how much sort of budgetary information is published in order to, basically trying to look 3 years ahead to have some idea of spend profiles, cash flow, where money is basically is planned to be invested in the next coming years. And then obviously timeliness as well, because again, the point of IATI data is it's as up to date as possible. So we do sort of monitor how frequently publishers are providing data. And that's something that is available for anyone. You can go and look at any donor and go to the IATI dashboard. I'll put it in the chat when I finish speaking, if you like that. Go and have a look, see how good or whether a particular publisher maybe needs some improvement. And I would certainly advocate, just picking up something that I think Tim, you said earlier. We would always say, if you are finding IATI data, if you do happen to use it in any aspect of your work, and you do come across data quality issues or information that's missing, I would certainly as well sort of advocate that if you can contact that publisher directly to tell them, because certainly in my experience, if a data user goes to a publisher and says, look, I need this data, this is really useful, can you give it to us, they will react much more quickly than if, say, you were to come through to us and on the IATI tech team centrally to have that conversation. So it's certainly something that I would say is always worth bearing in mind. If you want the data, it's always worth asking for it.
Thanks, Wendy.
That's a really, really useful point. And maybe we can start segueing into the next theme I wanted to pick up on, which was this, I can't remember which presenter mentioned this, but the extent to which organisations will go out and commission their own studies. And it's something we found in the landscape analysis as well, that you've got lots of ad hoc data collection exercises taking place, including where people are sending out spreadsheets collecting kind of project level information, but at the very headline level of, can you give us the name of the project, how much is being spent, where there seems to be a lot of missed opportunity there for collaboration on building data sets, rather than people gathering lots of data to write a report and then for that data to live in Excel spreadsheets on their local machines. So I just wanted to explore that theme a bit more, and if there's something that this project should pursue, not through IATI, but through those kinds of other data collection exercises, what could be done to make that an entry point to a better investment data landscape. Gabriella, did you want to say something? You've just got your webcam on, I think. Although you're muted, I believe.
Okay, hi. Can you hear me now?
We can hear you now, yes.
Yeah,
Can't
I'm
see
sorry. I know, it's like you can either see people or hear them, but you can't do both. So I just wanted to say this is sort of a simple-minded answer in some ways, but I think, we heard from so many people about, so many donors about them doing their own landscape analyses, and I think there's a real lost opportunity to at least gather those and share them. I think historically those kinds of strategy documents are kept as internal work products at foundations. And I think we could avoid a lot of duplication actually by just making sure that those are captured and shared and openly disseminated.
I think that's a fantastic point and would be really useful for this project to think about how that fits within its scope, and maybe links as well a bit to, I think Matthew earlier mentioned GoDan as an initiative trying to just encourage organisations to commit to more open data and opening up their publications generally outside of their kind of investment data sets. I see Marco's raising a hand. Do you want to unmute Marco?
Everyone should be unmuted. At this point, you just have to unmute yourselves in order to speak. Go ahead, Marco. You're a little quiet, so if you could speak loudly, that would be great.
I would want to say that I see a tremendous room in working as NGOs or as research organizations and as donors together on setting these standards up between us, so that I noticed in some of the background materials that there's some tools to extract data from ERP systems and then to map them to IATI standards, etc. I would say that the opportunity is in making the IATI standards embedded in our ERP system.
I think that's a really key point of how do we make sure some of these standards are there at source, because every time we're asking people to do extra work of classifying data later on or converting data, we reduce the chance of it happening. So finding good ways to do that's a challenge, but it's a really key point.
This is Matthew. I wanted to comment on that as well. Like, the more that we can get folks to have those data standards embedded, whether in reporting techniques, in software, in devices, in whether you're barcoding, relief food, in any way, shape, or form, having those systems, and that to me would be a priority, would be developing systems that can be deployed in multiple places, but for which the data standards are already embedded.
Thanks, Matthew. And just a reminder that if you're not speaking, if you could please mute yourself, that would be great.
This is Karen. I just kind of wanted to talk about some of the feedback that we got on this. So a lot of the bilaterals and multilaterals we spoke with did do their own landscapes and often would contract other organizations or other companies to do these landscapes and research for them as well. And they talked also about the need to share this more broadly so everyone's not collecting the same data repeatedly, but a few of the difficulties in doing this included, just the policy and process in place, but also some of those companies restricted them from sharing the data. They could, say USAID could share it within the government, but couldn't share it outside of that. And then other times they would get the data from local governments who had collected themselves, and again, they didn't quite have the power authority to share that more broadly. And so this is, well, I think there are ways, and they're thinking about, creating better practices around sharing this data. There are still some of these political bottlenecks and business bottlenecks in doing that. So it's also something to consider that will be difficult in making that happen.
That's a really interesting point there about how to, whether it's the contracts, the agreements people have with those people doing the research and what norms amongst the researchers. Any other thoughts on this question of how do we capture data outside of the IATI data but from other sources?
I think Marco might want to jump in again. I saw you raise your hand, Marco. Not sure if you wanted to make another point, and perhaps Matthew as well.
I was trying to lower my hand.
Okay. No worries.
So I'll just jump in and say, that maps directly with this conference we're planning in November. And if I get your guys' email addresses, or if there's a participant list, I'd be happy to send out the preparation slide. We're putting the International Organization Committee together right now. But the way we have it slated so far is there's basically two tracks for the conference. One is essentially ELSI, ethical, legal, social interoperability issues for getting interoperability between data sets, and the other is technical interoperability issues. So we see those as really, in essence, two separate workflows and tracks that people need to be in communication with each other. Essentially to build this, information superhighway and of food and health, and to figure out which are the toll roads essentially, and which are the roads where that are free to travel upon.
Fantastic, Matthew. You brought two really useful themes to the debate that maybe we can again open up, see if anyone wants to pick up on. One around the ethics here. And thinking carefully about is there data that shouldn't be disclosed, and whether that came up in anyone's kind of engagements and conversations. Certainly in some of the transcripts I've read, people are concerned about kind of competitive angles to not sharing data, but I'm curious if ethics came up at all. And secondly, you've raised the issue of what might be free, or what of this ecosystem of data enrichment and curation might need funding in different ways, and even commercial funding models. So be really keen if anyone's got thoughts on that, particularly say from the experience of the IATI world where intermediaries have needed funding.
And I just want to point out that Catherine from MCC just shared a lessons learned document from their Data 2X initiative, which is to make more gender disaggregated data available.
And we were releasing it to IATI, so it's IATI specific.
Thanks, Catherine.
That's fantastic. Well, maybe with 10 or 15 minutes left, I can take us into some of the very substantive kind of data field issues we're going to encounter in the coming weeks. Again, after this call and the next few weeks, we'll share with everyone a collaboration space where we'll be discussing these things in depth. But 3 or 4 areas that have come up: taxonomies, results, organizations, and location. Maybe I can start on location, as I see we've got a few location experts, I think, on the call. What are the, right now the IATI standard has quite a sophisticated way of saying where a project is located. But are there gaps? Are people seeing other things we need to be able to do around location? Or what's the most important bit of location information to have available?
Tim, this is Laia, and I'll just say that for our part in our consultations, this came out as a very strong need as well. There's differing opinions about what level of granularity you need in terms of location information. So some people want very, very detailed, sort of exact locations, but there seemed the second administrative level seems to be sort of a consensus point of that would be a good level to try to hit.
Yes, in the CG we came to the same conclusion as well. So that's the level we were trying to work against. This is like admin level 2. The other thing we were trying to implement is to have a little bit of taxonomy attached to each location, so kind of having people describe what type of location this is, because the range of ag activities is quite large. So sometimes it could be the location of an experimental farm or nurseries, as far as the CG is concerned. Or a location that's more permanent. Sometimes it's just a project location. Sometimes it's a location of a training event, and sometimes it's a location of a partner. So when we tend to receive those maps, it's probably very difficult to aggregate this information. So I mean, after some discussion, the level 2 admin unit was good, but also having a little bit of extra. Description of what the activity actually represents. I mean, what the location, actually represents.
Thanks, Mo. That's incredibly rich and useful.
The other point too, there was also discussions because admin level 2, there's a lot of administrative maps. So I think I believe IATI is encouraging the use of GAL or one version of the GAL, but I mean that is something you have to help users with typically, because between the UN, the GAL, and the GADAM and other administrative systems and national systems, it gets confusing. So that's something to keep in mind as well.
And if I could, sorry, I was just going to say that. As part of Interactions NGO Map initiative, we also, which gathers information on the work of our members at the project level, we're also trying to move to Admin 2, and something that we're finding is just that a lot of the gazetteers don't have very up-to-date information on what the current Admin 2 levels or boundaries are. So that's another area from improvement. And then making some of the sources that may be more up-to-date open so that anyone can use them. Some of them are limited to UN agencies, for example. I think that's another area for us to work on as well.
Fantastic. Any other thoughts on location before we move on? So The other area I've got down here is organisations, understanding the kind of organisation partners. I think a big theme coming up is knowing who are the partners working in a given area. An organisation data is notoriously difficult as well, of getting identifiers for things other than companies, and understanding not only kind of where their head office is, but where they're working on the ground. So I'm curious if people have particular experience of working with organisation data, again, kind of user needs or pitfalls of things we should consider. And certainly there's a theme here, Stephen. I think when we looked at the IATI data, we were finding there's not much in terms of, say, contact details. And a lot of user needs are saying we want to know who the person is. And I think we're seeing mainly it's organizational level kind of contact details. Is that right?
Yeah, I think we found it was mainly generic contact details across the organization rather than specific to that activity. We haven't looked so far into the quality of the identifiers of organizations in the IATI data sets, but again, I'd imagine that's quite reflective of where the wider IATI data sits too. It's a big challenge to try and, first of all, identify, and then secondly, uniquely identify organizations in common with others. So yeah, I also picked that up from the user research I've read as well, about having that clear understanding as to who's doing what.
Hi, Tim and Steve. I think sort of as a reference is something that I heard a lot, is that it would be useful to understand the participating organizations throughout the whole value chain. And it's not just one endpoint or another. It's just really useful to understand who's doing what throughout the whole value chain. And that's something that really came across, and I think that's like a bare minimum.
That's a good challenging bare minimum to aim for, so that's great. Maybe I'll use that to segue us to this theme of value chains, of understanding and classifying value chains. So I think across the landscape analysis of existing data, I started in our data set to create a column for, a structured data column for what sector classification does the data set use, and I realized it might as well have been a free text field because everyone was using slightly different classifications of crops and crop types and so on in their investment data. And so that's a big challenge ahead of us, is what kind of classification schemes might be needed for understanding value chains, crops, technologies, and so on. So a question for the taxonomists amongst us.
I'm not a taxonomist by any means, but when you spoke about organizations, you mentioned contacts. I would like to point out that there's often a dilemma in making contact information available versus privacy and ethical issues.
That's a really good point.
This is Matthew. I'm not sure exactly what you're looking for here in terms of talking about taxonomies. I do think it's important to move beyond taxonomies and into essentially computable ontologies, where we can start leveraging artificial intelligence for ontology-enabled case-based reasoning. We can do various, first-order logic reasoning, and so I think it's essential for organizations to look at how they can transform their taxonomies into, formal, tractable ontologies, and then actually, build systems using these ontologies. I think, and in fact, there's nothing keeping us from building ontologies around privacy. So that we can, compute when it's appropriate to share data and when it's not. And privacy is just one example. It could be a paywall. It could be other issues to prevent people from having access to data. But I think that that's an essential piece to moving forward with increasing the valorization of the data and the data collection process.
Thanks, Matthew.
Just a quick point. I mean, I totally agree with the previous speaker. And in fact, it was, I mean, within the CG, we did spend quite a bit of amount of resources on tracking, actually mining text document, because a lot of this information on ag technologies is to be found in both publication and some of the research programs proposals, and then document from partners. Like USAID actually did a big exercise trying to repertory technologies in Africa, I think it was, or specific technologies like climate smart technologies. So we did spend, like, months actually mining these documents to try to come up with a more structured ontology. And it's not an easy exercise. It's usually, I mean, this sort of skills are really hard to get by, and it's, we have a few ontology specialists at IFPRI and a few at Bioversity, but I mean, it's usually not what our organizations have or do. So it is a barrier. And then when you have an ontology, the other big barrier is people don't know how to use them at all, and we don't have the tools to make it really easy. So that's barrier number 2.
Thanks, Mel. Maybe if I can just ask a follow-up to you or anyone with experience of that kind of text mining, of how effective it is using that sort of approach to automatically classify or enrich records based on associated documents. Is that an avenue we should be exploring, or is that kind of an area where, unless we have access to many experts, we're going to struggle with?
This is Gabi from Foundation Center, and the work that we've been doing at Issue Lab, as well as auto-coding some of the grants data at Foundation Center on a larger scale. I think the text mining piece, it's been easier for us to do it, for instance, on grants with shorter, just where the text is less idiosyncratic and constrained in terms of length. When we've been trying to do it on, and I think this is maybe similar to what you were just describing, Mel, trying to do it on larger reports and on research pieces, we can certainly get part of the way and have had some success with that, and would love to have a separate discussion with people about that if they're interested. But still, getting back to the quality issues, it still at some point is requiring that we have human attention to it. So it gets us part of the way, but it's not the magic box that I think we need it to be. But I do think it's something that is worth a kind of collective investment rather than it being kind of one-offs at different organizations. So maybe that's a kind of separate working group in a way, because I think there's a ton of value and a ton of data buried in these long-form idiosyncratic reports.
This is Matthew. I think that that partnering with experts is absolutely the way to go. And you just hit it. I'm sorry, I don't know your name. You just spoke. And text mining is only one application of ontology, and it's a little bit like, I think, talking about how much money maybe we're spending on a new transportation system, and when it's only partially built, we haven't really seen the return on investment because nobody's using it. And so I think what we need to consider is all of the various things that can utilize in essence a new transportation system where we can query across scientific domains, where we can query across industry or nonprofit or governmental resources. You know, in Facebook, I can ask the question in the search box. I can say, show me which of my friends graduated from Harvard and went to Disneyland in between 2013 and 2016. I can ask that question and it will show me the answer and pictures. You know, and if I can ask that question of Facebook, certainly I should be able to ask questions about the relative nutrition and health improvement of a population based on a variety of different inputs. And none of that is going to happen until we start codifying these vocabularies into you know, computable vocabularies. And that's what I'm interested in doing. And text mining is just a very small part of that. That's how we sort of gather the initial, you know, vocabularies to begin with, and then you know, building them out is a whole other process.
There's a really interesting vision in that, as you say, for kind of that ability to answer those questions, as our user needs research came up with so much. I think in that user needs research, people are often asking for a map or for a kind of query interface, but when you describe what the Facebook searches we're familiar with using, often, you know, a vision that we should be able to do that for ag investment is a really useful vision, and for us to think what would it take to get there. So we've got maybe 2 or 3 minutes left. The last theme I had on my list was around results and goals information, but I think maybe given time we should just leave open for any closing thoughts people have on kind of key issues that need to be addressed in the coming weeks, and then we can just recap where we go from here.
Hi, it's Wendy. Can I just add something to what was it Matthew who just spoke actually about? I completely agree. Obviously, one of the things IATI is trying to do is some of that codifying effectively of data, and we have a whole series of vocabularies to obviously standardise, you know, what are allowed values and what data can be included in content. The point I was just going to make, though, was, of course, the biggest challenge we find with that is obviously working with publishers. Every organisation will have its own internal set of vocabularies or taxonomies or whatever, which its whole operation tends to be sort of welded around. So I just really wanted to flag up that, you know, as much as obviously getting to the data and getting it all sort of into a good shareable format, you know, it does go further back into the organisations themselves. We'll have to look at how they are generating that data at source, you know, and quite often it does require changes to internal systems, you know, not just IT systems, but business processes around. So it certainly can be done. It's perfectly achievable, but I think it's worth sort of flagging that up, really, that you know, having the standardisation of data is obviously just part of the solution, and you know, it's slightly larger than that.
Right. That speaks to my point of the fact that these ontologies can't be built in isolation. They can't be built by one organization. They have to be built in concert. And in concert with people across disciplines, in concert with people across economic sectors, if we truly want to have, in essence, the query interface that I just spoke of.
Great. So, any last words, particularly from also the kind of panelists? If not, then I'll say massive thanks, certainly from myself and Stephen on the Open Data Services side, and with the rest of the project team, we'll be getting together in a few weeks to really kind of carry on putting together these challenges that we have ahead, and then to certainly the IATI Ag working group that was mentioned, will be sharing a number of issue discussions to dig deeper into identifying ways we can go forward, and over the course of June, working towards a proposal for a range of tools and data standard changes that can deal with these areas of kind of quality, collection and curation of data. As Leia's put up on the screen, I'll let you talk to those final next steps.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention that, so as Tim said, the project team is going to be getting together in a few weeks on June 9th, and as part of that, we'd like to invite others to sort of react to our latest thinking in terms of how to take this work forward. So we will send information around to everyone about the full details for that, but just know that it's scheduled for June 9th. And then finally, if you would like to be involved, we've had great input just on this call, so if you would like to continue being involved in our work as we develop the standards and the tools and the support needed to make the data high quality and relevant to ag and food security practitioners, invite you to sign up for the Community of Practice, the IATI Ag Working Group, or the newsletter, and you can do that at the link that you see on your screen. We will share the presentation recording, the resources mentioned in the chat that no one could see, and any other materials that we think are relevant to you after this webinar. So thank you all for joining, and thanks to our presenters for sharing their findings.
Thank you.
Thank you,
everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Thanks, Tim and Stephen.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thanks again.